Very good. Well, a very, very warm welcome, first of all, from myself, Monica Bohm-Duchen. As many of you by now, I suspect, know, I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which took the form of a real-life nationwide year-long arts festival, and then has had an unexpectedly, and I have to say very gratifyingly rich afterlife, really entirely, well, almost entirely due to COVID, in that we have gone online and are producing an ongoing series of online events, such as this one. So, as you also will perhaps know, this event forms part of a series of events specifically focusing on different aspects of the rather morally murky but very fascinating internment episode of 1940 to 41. I suspect I'm telling you all what you already know, but just to sort of make it quite clear, we're talking about so still I think too little known episode in British wartime history, whereby the British government saw fit to intern mostly, but not only, on the Isle of Man, thousands of so-called enemy aliens, the vast majority of which were predominantly Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe. It is, as you may know, again, it's the 80th anniversary, well, actually slightly a year late, but it's still sort of the 80th anniversary of that historical episode. And in collaboration with Jewish Renaissance magazine, Insiders Outsiders has been delighted to present this series of internment-related discussion and screenings, as well as other events. We have two more next week, which I will tell you about at the end. But I think now is the time to introduce our two speakers for today. First of all, Jacquie Richardson, who I hope you can see writ large on your screens. Jacquie is the oldest child of the real subject of today's event, Klaus Hinrichsen and his wife Gretel, born just before the end of the Second World War in Hampstead, and she's lived in North London ever since, or certainly for most of her life. At home, she's asked me to sort of comment, her parents never actually spoke German, and it took her rather a long time before she realized that they weren't actually English in the strict sense of the word. So I'll just admit this person here. She originally trained as an actress. That's something, Jacquie, I didn't know, and in her own words failed, although Klaus always said she was a better actress in real life than on the stage. She worked briefly in the BBC's drama script unit, and then went into PR, public relations, and eventually set up her own consultancy. Her early clients included a very young Nigel Kennedy, and she was also responsible for launching the very excellent Almeida Theatre. For the last 3 years or so, she's been busy working on translating the letters written by her parents to each other during internment, which will certainly be discussed today, with Catherine Hallam-Howard, who I'm glad to say is in the audience, and I'm hoping, Catherine, you might chip in later if you're so inclined, as well as looking after her mother, Gretel, who is going to be 102 years old next week, and we all send her our very, very best, Jacquie. And Simon, with whom she's going to be in conversation, is a British journalist and author, contributing writer to The New Yorker. And most pertinently here, I could say much more about Simon, but I'll concentrate on the most relevant thing, and that is that he is about to publish a book with the lovely title, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, with, is it Spectre, is it? You're muted, Simon?
Scepter.
Yes, it is Scepter. Which, as he puts it in his own word, takes readers into Hutchinson Camp, where, of course, Klaus was interned on the Isle of Man. And we published in the UK in early February next year, and I've already sort of bagged him, as it were, to give a talk on his book in greater detail in the new year. Lovely. So I think over to the two of you. I shall render myself invisible. If everybody could just be sure to keep themselves muted, and as ever with Zoom events, if you would like to type your questions and comments into the chat as we go along, you're most welcome. Good. Over to the two of you.
Okay, well, just to let you know, we've sort of split the talk into 3 sections: pre-internment, and then internment, and then post-internment. For this first section about Klaus's early life, I was just going to ask Jacquie some questions, really. But I suppose before we get into that, I just wanted to start by asking you, Jacquie, anyone who is interested or has read about internment in Britain in the Second World War, or who has researched it, will have encountered your father through his writings, because they're so well known. He wrote so much about it. Your unique perspective is, of course, as his daughter. What is your impression, your abiding sort of memory of your father?
My abiding memory is we never knew anything about it, actually. He never talked about his life in internment. We had a Schwitters portrait which was hidden in a cupboard, and every time we opened the cupboard there was the portrait, but we didn't know what it was. He was an extraordinary man. He was fascinated by everything and everybody. He loved young people. And he spent most of his life, I think, in libraries, in the British Library or Leicester Square Library. And he was the most incredibly liberal man, and would be appalled at the state of the world nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's look at the roots of some of that, I suppose. Where did he grow up? What did his parents do?
He was born in Lübeck, which was a Hanseatic town, part of Schleswig-Holstein, in 1912. His father was a solicitor and notary, and had actually, he had been Jewish. He descended from the Sephardic Jewish Henricus family, but he converted to Christianity and married my grandmother, who was Aryan and who came from farming stock, and her family lived near Hamburg. So they got married. They had 4 children, the eldest of whom was Klaus, who went to the he went to the Katharineum Gymnasium school, where he had a classic education. So he did Latin and Greek. He told a wonderful story that he also did English, and his English teacher had been shot in the First World War and could only whisper. So for many years, he thought that English was only spoken in a whisper. So he was quite a precocious young person. He set up a magazine with 3 friends called the Viereck, which sort of lampooned the teachers, but came to the attention of a man called Carl George Heiser, who ran the museum in Lübeck, and who actually turned Klaus into rather a protege and got him to help organize exhibitions and generally encouraged him.
So, so I believe he started out, did 1 semester training as a journalist. So
yeah, I didn't know that till you told me that.
Doing that student magazine must have had an effect, and then something diverted him to art history. So just tell us a bit about where he worked and what his experiences were, I suppose, working there as a half Aryan, a half Jew, however he was termed.
Well, basically, he went to university and studied art, theatre history and archaeology, and he went to Berlin, Rostock and Munich, and wrote a thesis on the baroque sculpture Tonnies Evers, which was actually used very much. A lot of Evers' work was bombed in Lübeck, and that thesis was very much used for the restoration of the sculptures after the war. He wasn't really able to work very much. He wrote essays for a German dictionary, but he sort of was also helping, because of the onset of war, he was helping Jewish people export works of art, pretending that they were damaged. So he got Barlachs out to America, he got a Renoir out to Australia, but he wasn't very, very busy doing things whilst still in Germany.
Yes, I remember him saying that in order to export a piece of art, you had to bring in the amount of money it was worth before you could take it out. And so he got a timber merchant to come and evaluate the sculptures for their worth in wood, which was about 5 marks or something.
Yes, yes. And in fact, they are still with a member of the family in America.
Right. A cunning plan.
A cunning plan.
What effect did the Nazi rise to power have on his situation? You know, was he able to keep working, or
he couldn't really work? And in fact, on Kristallnacht, his dad and he and his brothers were arrested and taken. Well, his father was kept in overnight. Although the father tells a wonderful story that he was arrested with various wine merchants, and so they had quite a nice time. He got out, and in fact was then enlisted, or was asked to wait to be called up to join the German army. During that time, he decided that was not what he wanted to do. And so he persuaded some relatives in England that they should invite him to come over to England and continue his studies there.
Mm-hmm. Do you know when he arrived in Britain?
He arrived in Britain in May 1939.
Right. And as I understand it, he was on leave from the it was temporary.
He was on temporary leave from the German army. Yes. He had 3 months in England. Right. He was he then decided he was definitely not going to go back, and so he wrote a letter to his father saying that he'd broken his leg, and in fact he also went to the station and bought a ticket so that he could sort of prove, or his father could prove, that he had every intention to come back. But in fact, he never went back to Germany again after that.
And he hadn't broken any limbs?
He had broken absolutely nothing. He was just quite an inventive sort of liar.
That's a very good way to avoid to stay in a country, isn't it?
Yeah.
So then, just tell us a bit about how he met your mother.
He met my mother the day before war broke out. He was invited to a Lübeck family, and that family was also known to my mother's father. And in fact, he'd gone there to meet another girl, but this girl had brought my mother along, and he ended up spending the next 62 years of his life with my mother. She had come here to study English. Very sadly, she was a Jewish family, and very sadly, her father had been murdered on Kristallnacht, so she never went back to Germany. And the money ran out, so she had been at a language school, but once the money stopped, she wasn't really allowed to work. So she worked as a cleaner, as a dresser, as all kinds of amazing illegal jobs. And they moved in together pretty quickly. She was 20 when they met. And they lived together in Hampstead.
Mm-hmm. And what was Klaus doing during this time?
He was writing things still. He'd also got involved somehow or other with a chemical company and was representing them here, handling their distributions, a chemical publishing company. So he was organizing subscriptions, organizing the distribution of the magazines. He also, I think, was involved with the Quakers and was joined a group of émigré actors and went round works canteens singing carols in the East End, as far as I can gather, and also going to the cinema, having quite a nice life in a way, but not being able to do anything, and had to keep going to the police stations to register and things like that.
Mm-hmm. That's where we can trace your acting skills back to.
Yeah, fine.
And then so war breaks out, and there's the decision to hold these tribunals to class all the refugees according to their perceived risk. Do you know anything about his tribunal?
Well, his tribunal, they had to sort of categorize people, and he sort of fell between quite a few stools, really. So he went to a tribunal in Hampstead where he was assessed by 3 people to decide which category he should be. There seems to be a convoluted story that he knew someone called, I think, Jimmy Hauptmann, and he got an MP to verify that my father was all right. And when the judge asked my father about this man, my father said, "I've never met him in my life before," but he still seemed to pass the tribunal. And he was classed category C, which meant that he wasn't a sort of major risk to people, but he had to keep reporting to the police. He couldn't go out after midnight. He couldn't play the radio. There were all kinds of things he couldn't do.
Yes, he had to hand his maps in, I think, didn't he?
Did he have to?
Not allowed a bicycle, all that kind of thing.
Definitely not, but I could never see him on a bicycle in any case, really. So.
Well, I think if it's okay with you, should we move on to the internment bit? And I've got a few slides for that, so I'm going to share my screen now. And put that up. Can everyone see that? Okay.
All good.
Right. Okay, great. So here he is. So at this point, just to sort of contextualize his age, Klaus is 28 years old at this time, and he's got his category C rating. He says that, you know, the atmosphere in London, although there's a high density of refugees living in Hampstead, there's a lot of suspicion around, I suppose, of any Germans or Austrians. He says, actually, in one of his interviews, I quote, "Some sort of neurosis had taken grip. Anyone who was German was considered to be a Nazi." He describes sort of seeing any Jews seen on the London Underground, sort of in nice clothes or with good luggage. People would be suspicious of this, thinking, well, I thought everything had been taken from you, so how does this work? And this is sort of perspectives backed up by the refugee organizations who distribute a booklet at that time among all of the refugees that advises them to refrain from speaking German in the streets or from pointing out how much better this is or that is done in Germany, even if, and I quote, "it may be true," and to avoid becoming conspicuous in manner or dress. At this time, Klaus and Gretel are reported by a distrustful neighbour, and maybe cover your ears for this bit, Jackie.
I heard it, I know.
The neighbour suspected the rhythmic knocking of the bed at night might contain a coded message. And then Klaus points out very funnily that it's difficult to prove that you don't understand Morse code to anyone. Eventually, of course, I'm sure you all know about the history of this time, but it gets to sort of the spring of the following year, and the atmosphere in Britain has turned rather sour towards the refugees. Everyone believes that Britain is about to be invaded, and that actually some of the refugees and asylum seekers who have come to Britain may not be who they say they are, and may in fact be spies waiting, this fifth column as it's termed, waiting to rise up and support the invading forces. So the police begin their roundups. They come for Klaus, where he's living in a boarding house in Hampstead, and they turn up when he's at work and say to his landlady, "We've come to arrest Walter Bergman." And then the landlady explains that Bergman had already been taken the previous day, and then so the officer says glumly, "Are there any of the Germans living here?" And the landlady offers up Klaus's name to the officers, who duly return to collect him. I'm just going to quote a little bit from Klaus's own story, so it's not all my words. So this is him describing his arrest. He said, "They came at 7 a.m. in the morning. We were collected in a Black Maria. I packed my case and was taken to Haverstock Hill police station. The extraordinary misunderstanding of these Germans and Austrians. If they had said everyone with a letter A to C to report to a police station, we all would have come freely. We would even have grouped ourselves according to our category, because we're great organizers. But oh no, we had to be chased and hunted." Late in the afternoon, we were then taken to Kempton Park, the disused racecourse at the time. Thousands of people were there. It was complete chaos. The sense of grievance was that you had already had a tribunal. This was in a country known for the fairness of its judiciary. Oh, I'm just going to try and move that along, sorry. You had already gone through all this. You'd been classified as a harmless person. Now you were an intern. All the things that they said before were suddenly forgotten. This was the grievance. These people had come to England to find asylum. They had a common enemy. Now Klaus is taken from Kempton Park to Liverpool. On the dockside, his experience there, I think, is typical for many internees who have been arrested, who were heading on to either transit camps or the camps where they were going to wind up, in that passing bystanders, not really understanding who these people were, shout abuse and hurl stones at him and the other internees waiting on the dockside at Liverpool, accusing them of being fifth columnists and all the rest. They board the ferry. This is a journey that in peacetime takes a little over 2.5 hours, but during wartime it takes 4 hours, because the ferry has to make a zigzag pattern to avoid any mines that might be there. On the journey, it's sort of a discordant atmosphere. Klaus describes it as, he says that some of the younger people, one of them brings a guitar on board and they're singing some of the hits of the day, while a lot of the older men look, perhaps understanding a bit more about their situation, far less jovial. One of their guards chooses this time to disassemble and clean his rifle, and Klaus describes watching as the young man struggles to fit everything back together again, and then one of the internees says, "Oh, give it here," and does it for him and then hands it back, which I suppose it sort of shows some of the ridiculousness of the situation, where the people being guarded are cleaning the weapons of their guards. Klaus arrives on the Isle of Man on the 12th of July at about 10 o'clock at night, he says. I'm going to read again from his description of what this was. We disembarked in total darkness. This is at Douglas Harbour on the Isle of Man, struggling to find our belongings. We were marched up a wide, fairly steep road until we reached a long stretch of barbed wire fence, which ended at a high gate, flanked by soldiers with fixed bayonets. In the dim light stood a very smart regimental sergeant major. His name was Ambrose Harry Potterton, delightfully. Klaus didn't know this, I don't think. Briskly, he counted out 30 men and appointed one of them house captain. When a large group of young men approached the gate, the worldly wise RSM immediately appreciated what trouble 30 young boys together in a house of their own might cause and distributed them among allocated houses.
Simon, I'm really sorry to interrupt. There seems to be a little bit of kind of disturbance noise-wise, and I'm just wondering whether, first of all, everybody is muted apart from Simon. I would urge you to make sure that you are. Or Simon, whether it's something at your end.
It might be my paper, I'm sorry.
Might be your paper. I think it's amplified perhaps more than it should be. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Here's a picture of the ferry crossing, actually, by one of Klaus's friends in the camp. And then I'm just going to play a little clip of him. And this is Ambrose Potterton, the RSM there standing during morning roll call. You might see tucked under his arm, he's got a brass tipped baton that was sort of his trademark. And in some of the illustrations in the camp magazine later, you can always identify Potterton from that gleaming brass. Here is Klaus describing a little bit. This is during a film that was released in 1991, him giving a tour of the square, Hutchinson Square, one of 10 camps on the island where he was stationed, and giving a little anecdote about his first night.
The first evening when I came, I was completely distraught, very old doctor with a very long white beard, and he got this beard entangled in the barbed wire. So he was standing tearing in all directions. So other internees were trying to get it disentangled from the inside, and the soldiers did it from the outside. It's one of my most vivid impressions to see a man with a long white beard. He eventually then was transferred to the hospital.
So the next morning, the internees are told to meet at the top end of the lawn. There are, by the next day, there are 415 internees in Hutchinson, and they're told to meet at 11 o'clock for the official opening of the camp, which happened on the 13th of July, 1940. And there they gather and they listen to their officers, who sort of introduce themselves and explain the way in which the camp is going to be run. There's Captain Daniel, who is the camp commandant, who addresses them first, and then followed by the intelligence officer, Kasper Jørgensen, who's a 42-year-old Norwegian who spoke German, which was of great comfort, I think, to many of the slightly bewildered internees. Hinrichsen notes about him, he seemed to be a human being, possibly even intelligent. After this inaugural address, Klaus sort of walks around, sees who he knows or who he recognizes among the internees. On the ferry over, he'd met an artist called Erich Kahn, who was cowering under the lifeboat, I believe. And so he sort of understood that maybe there might be some artists in the camp, and he indeed meets Hermann Fechenbach at that time, who makes a lot of woodblock prints that you will recognize if you've seen any of the art produced at Hutchinson. Fechenbach had, according to Hinrichsen, a very short fuse and didn't really like Klaus. He offers to paint his portrait a bit later, and then Klaus has a very funny anecdote. I'll just read it out here. The painter refused to show the art historian his work until it was complete. When Klaus finally saw the painting, he understood why. The picture was of a very large house, and in the top room was a very, very small window where I was looking out. Perspective had been deployed as a weapon in this case. There's a sort of a delight, I think, for Klaus as he realizes that he's among some artists here. And I think that was common for some of the educated internees, because there was a sense of, I suppose, safety in eminence. The idea that if there were lots of brilliant men here in this camp, then surely the British authorities couldn't keep them locked up for very long. And indeed, that only becomes more the case on the second day, where at some point a few men emerge from their boarding houses carrying chairs and various things, and then set up around the square, clamber onto their pedestals, and then start giving lectures on their chosen subject. The reason being, there are lots of academics here, some from Oxbridge, others from other colleges, many of whom who had been helped out of their institutions in Europe and brought to Britain and found other work, but now they've been interned, and so they want to contribute, find something to do with their gifts, and they have a captive audience here, I suppose. During this time, another of Klaus's housemates, at least on this first week, is this chap here, Bruno Arons, who is an architect from Berlin. They stand together and watch some of this happening. Arons had organised lessons for the schoolboys in a previous transit camp, and so he feels, I think, a professional impulse to impose some order here, and he asks Klaus to accompany him to go and meet with Captain Daniel in his office to seek permission to organise a formal schedule of lectures, because it's all a bit chaotic. Arends christens this outfit, which is officially founded on the 17th of July, 4 days after Hutchinson's opening, the cultural department, and Captain Daniel insists that it be known as Hutchinson University, or when he wants to claim some ownership, my Hutchinson University. There's a committee put in place with different roles to arrange the different streams of lectures in the camp. Dr. Hans Rothfels, who's a historian at St. John's College, Oxford, oversees the schedule of academic lectures, and Klaus assumes responsibility for the so-called popular lectures on softer subjects. This is how he describes it. It was a rather touching scene. Grown men who, perhaps due to inflation, had left school at 16 to work and support their families, now had a chance to sate a thirst for knowledge, which they could not still. This is another Schwitters portrait, less well known than his others. I don't think this one's on the internet, of Marion Ruwitz, who was a very celebrated pianist who gave some concerts in Hutchinson, which now Klaus is going to talk about in this clip.
The cultural life was very active. Not only all the artists, but also concerts. Very ambitious. I think 8 full concerts in 3 months. And at the same time, there were theater performances. The theater group was formed. And a cabaret, of course, started straight away, which dealt more with topical questions. One of the topical questions was, did we get bromide in the sugar to suppress the sexual urges of the internees? So we wrote a new script which was called Romeo and Juliet. Nothing happened.
Then a couple of days after the cultural department is founded, there's a realization that there is a true celebrity in Hutchinson's midst. This is Kurt Schwitters, of course, the author Richard Friedenthal, who later became chairman of the Pen Club of German-speaking authors abroad, was the first to recognize him. And Friedenthal leads the artist by the arm and introduces him around the camp as the great Dadaist Kurt Schwitters. And Schwitters paints portraits in the camp, some of which you've already seen, of his friends, and as he put it in a letter to his mother later, people with interesting heads. And he paints Klaus's portrait at some point, and he does this in payment for a favor or appeasement. Schwitters would use the art historian's office that he'd been given in the office block as a studio space, partly because it was quiet, partly because it had an electric heater. And one day Klaus wanders into his office to an unsettling scene. A man stood under the heater, fully naked, his face red from the electric fire, his feet blue from the ambient cold. And when Klaus explains that if Schwitters plans to paint live nudes, he could no longer use his office. And so the artist offers to paint present his portrait by way of apology. That's the one that we saw on the first slide. I'll put it up again later. Okay, I'm just going to whiz through. There's so much to talk about, but I'll whiz through this next bit. So, of course, because there are a few artists in the camp, something of a scene starts to develop. They come together. This is Fred Ullman, who actually, let me play this quickly. This is Klaus on describing what it was like to be internment Schwitters from a broadcast. This was very early after he first starts talking about his experience being of internment.
For the time being, it was not his work, but his lifestyle, which approached Dadaist anarchy. The inmates of the house where he lived discovered that he was unable to sleep in a bed. He could only sleep under it. Not surprisingly, they allotted him a small attic room for himself where he built a sort of nest underneath the bed. Actually, he considered this space a kennel, for he could not go to sleep until he had turned himself into a dog and barked. Night after night, he barked for minutes on end. One night, on the opposite side of the square, a respectable banker could no longer suppress a lifelong urge to bark likewise. And from then on, every night, to the consternation of the military who did not allow animals in the camp, 2 invisible dogs barked furiously across the lawn. A little later, Schwitters took to visiting every one of the 40 or so houses after breakfast, carrying a bucket. Politely, he would ask the cooks for any leftover porridge and collect it in his bucket. Now, porridge is not a German or Austrian culinary speciality, and some cooks produced a soggy mess and others rock-like lumps. All this Schwitters took back to his attic for purposes unknown. At the time, I was helping to organize the first art exhibition in the camp. Captain Daniels, the camp commandant, had been delighted when he discovered so many gifted artists amongst his internees and was anxious to show off their talents to his colleagues in other camps by staging a great art exhibition. To make this possible, he gave his artists studio space outside the Kommandatura and helped them to obtain materials for painting and sculpture. Shortly before the opening of the show, Schwitters called me to his attic. There in the middle of the room stood, or rather shook, some quite disgusting-looking greenish monolith with webs of mold growing down the sides and exuding a sickly and evil smell. They were studded with pebbles, bits of wood, rusty nails, and some of the debris he had collected so assiduously. These were the world's first Dadaist porridge sculptures.
Wonderful. So let me whiz through this bit. So the artists get together in an annex on the end of House 15. This is Fred Ullman, who was in the mix, friends with lots of them, sort of relatively new artists, who here has been sketched by Ludwig Meidner, very, very well-known German expressionist, I believe. The cafe that they congregate in adopts the name Café chez la Dame Absente, probably at Ullman's suggestion, because he was living in Paris before this. There were no membership cards, no rejections. Anyone creatively engaged could join. And so out of this scene, as we heard Klaus describing there, the first art exhibition is held on September the 15th, so the camp's been open a couple of months at this point. Hinrichsen later says it was too early, not enough work was ready, and so they wait a little bit. Here's a list very quickly of some of the artists who were in the artists' cafe. A little bit later, to coincide with the building of a grand new, or not, I don't know if it was grand or not, but a new hall inside Hutchinson Square for them to put on events. They decide to house a second art exhibition to coincide with the opening of this. And Klaus assumes the role of curator for this. Klaus had, I believe, actually attended the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Munich in 1937. And you can see here that behind Hitler is one of Schwitters' collages that's been arranged at an angle. Here is the catalogue for the second art exhibition that Hinrichsen curates. he sort of, with the modest power comes modest misery. It was his privilege and burden to choose which works by which artists could be shown, and lots of them complain that they're not getting enough space and are not enough primacy. In fact, Klaus describes it as a nightmare. No artist is ever satisfied with the number of his works accepted, nor with the space where they were shown. Where they were shown. But he takes a magnanimous approach and allows those artists who he doesn't rate to also show their work. We can see here some of it arranged. Now, up on the wall here, we can see there are these are tent pegs, if you can see, sort of in a splay to the right. These have been whittled by Hans Gusfield, who was a businessman in Hutchinson. He'd been in Prees Heath, which was a tented transit camp prior to this, and he stole some, or took some of these tent pegs when he came to Hutchinson, and then was sort of encouraged, I suppose, sort of folk art to make them into crocodile letter openers. So, you know, they were sort of esteemed artists who were exhibiting here, but also people who had just taken it up recently as a way to get involved. I'm going to skip forward because we're running out of time. So I'm just very quickly going to say Klaus is very pleased with how the exhibition goes. He writes a sweet poem that appears in the camp newspaper. The mystery at last got lifted. How many people here are gifted, he writes. Now, just on a very last note, all this frenetic organisation and schedule making masked really for lots of the men a seething sense of fear, betrayal, hurt and anger, and all this fevered activity distracts from an underlying state of enforced aimlessness. Here is Klaus just describing that.
For artists, it was really quite good because they were occupied. But if you are a publisher or some kind of engineering manufacturer, so you could do anything here. And many people succumbed to this and just played cards all day long. Or it's walking around and doing nothing and moaning and groaning. The important thing was, from the point of morale, to get everybody involved. But as it is, people were having tremendous depressions, particularly when bad news came from London. There was a suicide. There were people who had to be taken into the local hospital.
Yeah, in fact, 45 men died in the Isle of Man camps, either from heart attacks or other ailments, or in some cases from suicide, as Klaus said there. I just want to end with a quote from Klaus. This was from a talk that he gave at the Woodlands Art Gallery in Blackheath in 1992. Just because I suppose sometimes talking about the rather exciting scene and some of the things that are created with a bit of distance, we can perhaps forget probably the sense of isolation and fear and not knowing what was happening. Of course, a lot of the men were very worried that Britain was in fact going to be invaded, and if that was going to happen, then the British had handily rounded up all of the Jews already for the invading Nazis, so that there was a lot of anxiety around. He writes, "Lest this all sounds too rosy a situation, let me assure you that all these frantic activities were entered into as a means of distraction from the ever-present anger at the injustice of being interned, the constant worry about wives and children left without a provider and under almost nightly bombardment in London and other towns, and from the lack of communication, and of course, our own suffering from the cramped living conditions and the lack of freedom of movement." So, Jackie, shall we have a quick chat about, stop sharing. Oh. Has that stopped sharing? Yes, okay, right. So, Jackie, I know that your mother went to visit Klaus on the island.
Yes,
can you tell me about that?
She tried desperately to go from her letters. She was constantly trying to get permission to go, and it kept being rejected, and she couldn't hear from the Home Office. And she finally went in December 1940 and was very, very excited. But on the way, her boat on the way to the Isle of Man hit a mine. And so they all had to be evacuated, and she picked up 2 little children and was brought onto a fishing boat and arrived in the Isle of Man with 2 little children. And in fact, 50 years later, some man wrote to the Isle of Man and said, this has happened to me. I was saved by some lady who took me to the land, and he got in touch with my mother, and that was the little boy that she'd actually rescued. So she arrived in the Isle of Man. They had 3 days together. She wrote letters to him every day from the hotel. She didn't see him very much. She was very, very shaken by the journey and dreading the journey back, but they did actually get to see each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think Bloomsbury House specifically advised wives not to visit the Isle of Man, so
yeah,
she did well to get there and to see him. So when Klaus is released in the summer of 1941, what does he do?
Well, he comes back with an absolute mountain, suitcases of pictures and magazines and things. He had originally signed up for the Pioneer Corps, and in fact, when he was originally taken to the Isle of Man, he was supposed to be going to the Pioneer Corps and was posted missing from the Pioneer Corps as well, right at the start. He had suffered bouts of ill health in the camp, and so he was not allowed to join. He was not well enough. So he was put into the Home Guard and defended. He was a very good shooter. So he was put into the Home Guard and defended the BBC against attacks, which seemed a bit ironic. And he had met in the camp someone who had a chemical business. So he worked for a chemical business, and he started sort of trying to set up a life again back in London. He wrote a lot. He occasionally went, which is one of your questions, he went and met fellow refugees at Café Berthaud, and they would always come together and then do the Schwitters, Lankertorgel, PPP, which was the sort of a cry that they always carried out. And he tried to earn a living. Sadly, he was unable to work as an art historian, which is what in Germany, he would have become definitely a curator of gallery, but that wasn't allowed. And he didn't want to be set up in a commercial art gallery because he hated people who said, is this painting going to be worth some money? So he wasn't tolerant about that.
I suppose many of the internees, when they were released, tried to either suppress the fact that they had been interned or didn't necessarily want to broadcast that fact, and of course also in many cases change their names to more English sounding variants and all of that. Klaus didn't do that, and he did talk a lot about what he had been through, albeit a little later in life.
Only after the broadcast, the Radio 3 broadcast, was extraordinary. That was a sort of change of his life, really, because after the broadcast, the next day, there was a phone call from a lady who went Lankertorgel PPP, and that turned out to be Edith Thomas, Wanty, who was Schwitters' wonderful companion. And they became the firmest of friends. Every day, Wanty phoned or wrote him a letter. He introduced her to auction houses. He took her under his wing. He introduced her to Nick Sirota at the Tate. She always thanked him. A commission, if she sold a picture, was to take them to the Café Royal for tea. And she was completely delightful. She called him Schwitters. She could never pronounce the word Schwitters. And also from that phone call, he got a call from someone called Peter Daniel, who turned out to be the son of Captain Daniel, who said, this is fascinating. In my loft, I have a whole collection of pictures. I don't have a clue what they are. And I also have a whole lot of photographs. And so Peter and my father got together, became incredibly good friends. And from that, the whole new career started. He then gave lectures everywhere. He talked on the Weimar Republic at the Imperial War Museum. He talked at various Tates. He went to Hanover. He became absolutely known as the authority on internment, on art in internment, on Schwitters. Auction houses asked him in to identify portraits. So it became his sort of new life, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of fitting, I suppose, that his the rise, or his eagerness to talk about this sort of thing, this period of his life coincided with a rise in stock of Schwitters, who, I suppose at the time when he was in the camp was not was not particularly well respected, certainly in Britain, and I think his stock had even fallen in Germany. And it was only really after he dies that people really start to pay attention, certainly here in this country. And it seems that, it's when Schwitters starts to have a lot of attention and interest, that's when Klaus is sort of, I suppose, it maybe reawakens that art historian in him, and he wants to start really.
But it gave him a role, I think. It gave him something could sort of get his teeth into.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that he saw himself as the sort of promoter of Hutchinson's legacy, and in some ways the keeper of the stories as well. And you shared with me some of the letters that he wrote to people who he thought had got those stories wrong, and was very, very cross about it. I wonder, how do you think he would have felt about us meeting here today to talk about his role in all of this?
I think he would have giggled. He would have been tickled pink. I think he would have been really pleased, because I think he thought a lot of those artists, had they remained in Germany, could well have been very great artists. And that was none of them really, I mean, apart from Schwitters, and a lot of them have done very well and done fantastic things. But I think that was his view. So I think he, particularly Erich Kahn, he absolutely championed Erich Kahn. He, when Erich Kahn died and all his things were being thrown away in a skip, my father was phoned and got all his diaries, all his pictures. He tried to promote him wherever possible, because I think he thought he actually was a very great and unrecognized artist.
Yes, yeah, and I suppose his own trajectory was sort of knocked off course with this. If his dream of becoming an art historian, like that of the artist, he did also his trajectory suffered, I suppose. But
he was never bitter. I mean, he was the most positive, forward-looking. I mean, the cup was always half full as far as my parents were concerned.
Wonderful. That seems like a good note to end on. Monica, do you want to take over?
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Jackie and Simon. We could listen to you for a lot longer, but I think, yes, let's see what questions might come in. So everybody, please do start typing in anything you might like to ask. We already have one from Ian. I'm not sure who Ian is, but perhaps you can tell us. Jackie, I met your father back in 1988, spending an afternoon with Klaus and one tea, which I can still recall with great warmth and pleasure. Ian, do you want to make yourself seen and tell us a little bit more about how you fit into the story?
I'm not particularly unseen, the camera's on.
Okay, fine, sorry.
It's not really a question, it was just a comment to say I signed up for this because I recall that afternoon quite well. I was at the time planning some celebrations for the 40th anniversary of Schwitters' death, as it were, sort of commemorative events that were going on. And I've got a feeling from what you've said, it was Wanty that probably introduced me to Klaus, because I'd got to know her. So yeah, but I remember it being a wonderful convivial afternoon. So it was just a comment rather than a question.
Was that at my parents' house?
No, we met in a pub somewhere, but I can't remember where.
Right.
No, it was, I think it was somewhere, it was somewhere South London, I think, but
Right.
yeah.
Perhaps I could just add to that. I was saying, in fact, to Simon and Jackie before we started properly, that I remember with great pleasure and fondness my first-hand encounter with Klaus. It was when I was a very junior sort of art history person, curator at the beginning of my career in 1985, in fact, when I was involved with the curation of I think actually, though I say it myself, quite a landmark exhibition called Art in Exile in Great Britain, 1933 to 45, which started off life in Berlin and then came in rather condensed form, it's true, to the Camden Arts Centre, but was really, I think, an important moment for people to start taking proper stock of the huge contribution of the refugees to this country's culture, which of course is what Insiders Outsiders is all about. And I think he gave, Jackie, I think I remember distinctly, he gave a talk at the Camden Arts Centre, which indeed may have perhaps opened that door and set the ball rolling. I'd like to think that that was the case.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
Any other questions or comments at all? Perhaps I can just sort of throw in a few thoughts. I think it's really important, Simon, that you ended up with a kind of sobering reminder that for all the entertaining stories and the way that they make us smile, and for all the kind of tolerance perhaps with which the former refugee turned internees regarded their experience behind barbed wire, courtesy of the British government. It must have been in many ways a very dark experience. I mean, you know, that sort of sense of uncertainty and also betrayal. I mean, one thing perhaps that one needs to stress even more, that sense of betrayal. You know, here's a country where you think you've been taken in and look what happens. And I think that surely never quite went away. I don't know, Jackie, whether your father actually talked about that at all in later years.
No, but I think he thought he was well looked after in the camp. I think he thought they were very fair to him in the camp. And as I say, they didn't talk about it. It was never, it was the past. And I think he lived in the present very much. I must add, though, that his archive is at the Tate, which is wonderful. And I think his biggest thrill would have been that his portrait was made into a postage stamp by the Isle of Man. And most of my friends got Christmas cards that year with the stamp, which was absolutely fantastic. And he would have just giggled about that.
Lovely. And you showed Simon an image by Fred Ullman, whose internment work, to my mind, is actually his strongest work, an interesting character with a fascinating story of his own. But I think it's very striking, and I'm sure you know this, Simon, but you know, when you look at that, the work that he did there, and you showed one of the sort of lighter works, which were kind of, you know, descriptions of the life around him, but he did an almost sort of Goya-like series of ink drawings, which are really very dark, or, you know, sort of like Kubin. I mean, you know, the expression is sort of expressions of anguish, one might say. And then as time went by in the subsequent kind of rehearsing of that episode, yes, it was short, but, you know, significant clearly in his life, that sense of darkness disappears. It's sort of consciously or otherwise. And I think that is, I think I'm right in saying, very much a trend that you see, that actually at the time the feelings may have been much darker, or certainly more mixed, than they let on in later years, out of a sense perhaps of ultimate loyalty to their adopted country and many other things besides. But it's an interesting phenomenon, I think, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, Fred he edited his diary that he wrote at various points in his life, and I think each time he edits it, it becomes a bit softer in his judgment, which I think was common to lots of the internees who, you know, as you say, in the moment feel very depressed. And Jackie mentioned the letters that she's been working on the translation of, which you know, communicate that. But then when you hear Klaus talking about it on those videos, there's a sort of twinkle in his eye, and he can see the humor in it. And I think partly that's a natural human thing, that, you know, when there's old difficult things we go through, we sort of diminish the pain of it and try and look for the happier moments. But then, of course, also I suppose the you know, to put in inverted commas, the happy ending of the episode, you know, that Britain wasn't invaded, and all of the terrible things that would have happened as a result of that, particularly to the internees on the Isle of Man, didn't happen. And then, of course, when the full details of the horror of the Holocaust are revealed, that puts the experience in a different light, I think, for a lot of the internees. So it's a very complicated way to judge the value and the pain of the episode, I think, for people.
And of course, in the historical context, you have to remember, you know, we're talking about the, as you say, the imminent invasion of this country, about Dunkirk, about, you know, sort of a pretty dark and dismal time in British wartime history. So it's quite easy, I think, in retrospect, to justify the actions of the government. And yet, I can't help thinking it's incumbent upon us now, who didn't go through it directly, to look more critically at the actions of the government and that, you know, the kind of the details of that history, and which is exactly, of course, what you're doing in your wonderful book. I wonder if I could ask, since I can't see any other questions coming in, but please, your time is running out, do start typing if you'd like to. But I was, some of you may know, the earlier event today at 6 o'clock was about Jack Bilbo, who's a wonderfully eccentric, larger than life artist and self-styled cultural impresario, who set up the first, well, in fact, the only gallery in wartime London, called the Modern Art Gallery, and showed Schwitters, among others, and Picasso even, and a whole host of artists, well-known and not so well-known, many of them former refugees, but he was the person really in charge of cultural life in Unken Camp, and I believe in fact in Rachel Dixon's excellent essay on art in the internment camps in the Insiders Outsiders companion volume, which some of you may already know about, she actually quotes, let me just take my glasses off and read the quotation. She quotes your father, Jackie, as being rather kind of derogatory about the Unken Pioneer, which was the camp newspaper. Unken, incidentally, is just outside Douglas, not far away at all from Hutchinson. And he described it, yes, it's aesthetically inferior to Hutchinson's publication, The Camp, describing it as, and I quote, far more polemical and hard-hitting editorials, except for the sculptor Hermann Nonnenbacher and the designer Henry, and the graphic work was unimpressive. And I just wonder, Simon, maybe you can answer this, to what extent there was a kind of cultural rivalry between these two camps, which are indeed, I think, rightly known for the richness of their cultural activities.
I don't think it was cultural. I think Captain Daniel was incredibly proud to have all these artists, because the other camp was very good at football, and no one in Hutchinson played football, and so he had his art and other camps had their football. And I think, Simon, you'd know more because you've done much more on all the cultural side of things, but certainly that's what Daniel was terribly proud of.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I was going to say, is that it was a top-down thing. I think Daniel was very competitive. There was a lot of competitiveness between the different commandants, and part of that was self-interest, because I think they probably believed at some point the number of camps was going to be reduced, and they wanted to remain the one that was open. And so Daniel's constantly trying to look for things that will make his Hutchinson the one that they keep with. I mean, just a quick note on the difference on tone between the two newspapers. Partly that is because the editor of Hutchinson's newspaper, The Camp, Michael Corvin, or Leo Freund as he was actually named, he had worked in Germany on the sort of cultural pages of the newspaper. I can't remember which newspaper he came from, but he sort of, that was the world that he came from. The world of journalism was not hard-hitting news. He wasn't editing the op-ed pages. He was sort of doing nice reviews of gallery openings and things like that. So I think probably some of the tonal difference is due to that.
Indeed, but I think nevertheless, I mean, Unken was another camp that had a strong contingent of artists and should not be overlooked. And of course, there were other artists spread over Sefton and other camps besides, but Hutchinson certainly was a special case. Right, as I say, it is now nearly 9 o'clock, and I think it's probably time to draw things to a close. Does nobody have anything else they would like to chip in with? I don't know, Jackie, whether your brother would like to say something. I don't want to put him on the spot at all, but I don't know.
I was just thinking about that.
Oh, please do turn your camera on so we can see you. And
right, let me just see. I thought I had the camera on. Bear with me.
Sorry, actually, hold on. I think it's because just hold on a second. Let me just remove those spotlights, and then I think we'll be able to see you. Go ahead.
Yes, he's there.
Yep.
I can see me.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Hi. I mean, it was not really about the fact that my father really did not talk about that period for an awfully long time. And I think the first time that I got any kind of inkling about it was when I was in my early teens and I bought an air pistol. And my father had an intense dislike of guns, but when I got it, he picked it up, took a couple of shots with it, told me it kicked slightly to the right. And that's when I discovered that not only had he been stationed on top of the BBC building to defend it, but he actually spent the remainder of the war in shooting competitions in Bisley, because he was training as a sharpshooter, as a sniper. But I think that says an awful lot. It was a period that for a long, long time was in the past, and then later on was something that he felt throughout his life, both the situation of refugees and of those seeking asylum, was something that needed to be remembered in history. And it's no surprise really that right up to his death, he was a supporter of the Foundation for Medical Victims of Torture. And that's, I think, the indelible thing, is that it was always there, but it just came out at different times.
That seems a very appropriate point on which to end, indeed. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so no other questions, much to my surprise. So let's almost call it a day. I'd just like to mention one thing that I'm sure will be of interest to many of you, and that is that Simon Parkin is going to be one of the people talking on the Isle of Man itself. Some of you may already know this, but in association with Jewish Renaissance and also the Association of Jewish Refugees, Insiders Outsiders had planned to take a group of people, actually next week, I mean, goodness me, to the Isle of Man. We went to great lengths to make it all work, and then of course COVID, everything kind of started working against us. Hold on, there's one more question. I'll just finish saying this and then we'll hand over to Stephen Nader, who would like to ask something or say something. Anyway, yeah, flights were being cancelled. It was all proving just too problematic. So for safety's sake, we decided to postpone the trip to late March next year, 27th to the 30th of the dates. And Simon will be talking, Yvonne Cresswell, David Wertheim, I see in the audience here on the Isle of Man itself, will also be contributing. It should be a fascinating event, and the more the merrier. We've got a lot of people already signed up, but if you'd like to know more, if you go to if you type in Jewish Renaissance, enemy aliens on the Isle of Man, all the full details of the trip will come up. There are still places available, I do believe. Sorry, Stephen, would you like to say something?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Hi.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say how much
Hello, Jackie.
how much Chris and I have enjoyed this. My mother was Klaus's first cousin, so Jackie and I are second cousins, and the Hinrichsen family were very close to my family all the way through my childhood. So while I heard very little about the Isle of Man, I was certainly aware of Klaus having been there for a while. Just one little anecdote on a very light note. Our two families would get together every Christmas, and Jackie's going to know what I'm, and Nick too, what I'm about to say. We'd get together first of all at my parents' house, and then later on the next day at the Hinrichsens. And when the Hinrichsens came to our house, which was on Christmas Eve, after a few minutes, Klaus would suddenly say, "Oh, I've got to go to this important business meeting." And about 10 minutes after he'd left, and of course it never occurred to us as children that nobody would go to a business meeting on Christmas Eve. About 10 minutes later, Father Christmas would arrive, and you have to remember that Klaus was very tall, and so made a very imposing Father Christmas. And he would then hand out presents and do the whole Father Christmas thing. And then he would disappear, and suddenly Klaus would be back 10 minutes later. And it was always a lovely, lovely occasion, and it fooled all of us children for several years. So just thought maybe you'd like that light note to end up with.
Thank you very much indeed. So it just remains for me to alert you to the fact that we have two more events at 6 o'clock and then up. Right, Edith, yes, don't worry. I will, Aviva, can you see? Actually, you probably can't. Somebody who's interested in the Isle of Man trip. Don't worry, you will hear, rest assured. Sorry, that's a small digression there.
I'm going to put the link to it in the chat.
Oh, fine, please do. Please
Yeah.
do. Here's the link for the trip for anybody who's interested in finding out more. Yeah, no, just briefly to say there are two more events at 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock next Thursday, the 14th of October. One of them is a kind of two-person presentation about was Ines Newman talking about her grandfather, Hollicher, who was a refugee and engineer by profession, and his friendship in Hutchinson Camp near Liverpool, which some of you will know about already, with Hugo Dachinger, who was an artist Austrian-born like Hollicher, and the discovery of the diary that describes their encounter and so on and so forth. So that should be absolutely fascinating. And then also music was mentioned, Klaus talking about the richness of the musical life in Hutchinson. The event at 8 o'clock will be with Norbert Mein, the tenor and founder of a wonderful musical project called Music, Migration and Mobility, in conversation with Eva Fox-Gall, who is the daughter of Hans Gall, who was a really well-established composer who ended up in the Isle of Man, like so many other remarkable people, as we've heard, and ended up writing the music for a brilliantly satirical cabaret called What a Life, and there will be further discussion about that. So please, if you're interested, do sign up for those as well. I'm just looking, there was one more, is there another? Fine, anyway, there's some information there in the chat if you would like to take a look there. So it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to Jacquie and Simon. What a wonderful presentation and exchange of information and insight.
And all go and buy Simon's book. It's
absolutely. And just
brilliant.
remember, Simon's book is coming out, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, coming out in early February. And as I say, I'm booking him in most definitely to give a talk to coincide with the publication. I've also had the pleasure of reading the manuscript, and it makes for an absolutely wonderful read. And as I say, he's also going to be joining us on the Isle of Man. So good night, everyone, and thank you for being our audience tonight. And I hope to see you again. And again, thank you, Jacquie. Thank you, Simon. All the best.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacquie.
Bye.
Bye.